I do plan on introducing a major cap and invest bill again in 2020. I'm working with tribes, working with the environmental community, working with British Petroleum and many other industry players. I'm very serious about it. We also are coordinating with our friends in Oregon. You read about a lot of the activities in Oregon, partnering up, excuse me, with Oregon legislators as well as California. So we're trying to build a West Coast collaborative that really builds the momentum of a responsible market-based system, which recognizes our uniqueness as an aviation state and a timber and agriculture in a responsible way. So the question is, California's cap and trade has some issues around allowing large-scale polluters to continue to pollute in areas that are disproportionately impacted, lower income communities of color and others, and what am I going to do to avoid that? So I would say that a couple things. First of all, thank you, because you're absolutely right. There are challenges. The 100% renewable bill had the strongest social justice language ever passed in an environmental bill. It also had the strongest labor standards. You don't get a tax break if you're a large company unless you meet standards that the workers who are building this get to contribute and benefit as well. So the answer, I think, very specifically is that California has very much learning. This is the first major rollout of cap and trade in the nation, and the aggregate amount of pollution is what matters. As we know, pollution doesn't follow political boundaries. It doesn't care whether you're a city or a county or a rural area. So the question is, what are we doing with recycling and what's happening in the state? I think a couple of things. It's an area where, due to the decision by China to require full purity of the recycling waste that they import. So what that means is that when you take your big blue container and you throw things in there that are not supposed to be, that it's contaminated and China won't take it and it ends up in the landfill. It's really important to understand that. That is absolutely true. So there's a couple things. We're trying to figure out how to support the counties to allow greater separation, but it's tough because it impacts consumers directly. And of course, they get resistant to that. We have a lot of activity around single-use plastics. So the Department of Ecology is doing an analysis and has done an analysis of all the single-use plastics, and we're trying to find ways to reduce those single-use plastics in partnership with the business community. So the question is we live in a bubble a little bit, and what does state action mean relative to federal inaction? How does it compare, and what's the value of that additional state action? So ultimately, I mean, the United States is something like 15+% of global, and so we need a global community to care by its very nature. But you know, I think when you think about it through deeply spiritual eyes and think about the fact that every act of goodness changes the world, and how can you not see the goodness that comes out from an act of kindness? And I think climate action is that same core concept. We are obligated to act. And I believe that from a data point of view, an evidence and a science point of view, that best practices really get embraced, that other states, phone's been ringing off the hook. The environmental reporters covering this bill said, they called my bill, the gold standard of environmental legislation. And so legislators, I have a conference call with a legislator, couple of legislators from other states next week, talk about how we did it. So sharing those lessons learned at the state level does have incremental value. It absolutely does. And you know, that's part of the challenge. So the question was the clean fuel standard, which is that legislation that requires sort of a less potent gasoline, if you would, and less carbon emission, more biofuels, that it didn't pass. It passed the House, State House, it went to the Senate, and it came to my committee, passed out of my committee, went to the Transportation Committee, and did not pass out. So his question is that because the chair of the committee was opposed to it and thought that it competed with a gas tax for revenues? The answer is that the chair of the committee, the Transportation Committee, has a deep sense of skepticism that clean fuel standards is a policy that works. And so he's not religiously and categorically opposed to it, but he has deep policy skepticism. There is some evidence that prices have increased in California and Oregon associated with it, But there's also a lot of evidence that there's a huge incremental benefit too. So it's not cut and dry. I think there's a lot of support for it. I do believe we can pass it, but I think there's a legitimate policy debate about how we would pass legislation like that and raise money for culverts and the transportation package, because we need public infrastructure. So it's a very complex balance. I support it, and I'd like to see it pass.